was in 2018, the year of the horrid smoke that had us housed in the high school for the entire season, that we did your piece, Mason, Passage.
Right.
And I guess I'll just start off with a question, because I've made the score video now, and like going through your score, I just love like your scoring, and it's also clean. And what I really appreciate about your music in particular is that it's like, unlike some other composers who will remain nameless for the time being, it's the kind of stuff you can just kind of pull out of the box and do, and like, so I guess two-part question. Is that something you consciously sort of strive for in your works? And the second part being about specifically to Passage, how you married the Moonshot speech with the Whitman poem. Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, well, thanks for the nice comments about the orchestration. The truth is that, yeah, as I've been writing from orchestra for like 25 years, I more and more appreciate the perspective of the musicians, especially because I sometimes play on stage. I understand a little bit more what it means to look at a part and how that's supposed to fit in. But, that piece was quite different in the premiere. I mean, the same piece, but whenever you have like a concerto, and I consider this kind of concerto piece, you really have to carve out, almost like as if it's a spectrograph, the sonic field around the soloist. And there was a lot of dialing back of specific instruments, a lot of things like, suddenly going to just like one solo instrument. And it takes a couple of performances to get that. I noticed that, when you hear a John Adams piece or in any piece by a phenomenal composer that's played a lot, you're like, wow, that's just, everything is perfect. And the really good composers will edit. And it's great to do that sometimes with a great soloist like Sasha, who is right there with you and you're talking about these things. Often a great conductor like Teddy, who's also a composer and understands that perspective. Super helpful. The Moonshot business was interesting. It's a great example. I get this all the time in my life of you might not get what you want, but it could be better. And I initially had wanted to set some of the Robert Frost poems because Robert Frost was a friend of Kennedy, spoke at his death, his funeral and inauguration, everything. So then I started looking elsewhere and I found this phenomenal Walt Whitman poem about American exploration and ingenuity. And it actually was just so much better because his language is so vibrant. The images are so rich. And there's this kind of like aspiration and enthusiasm that really matches Kennedy. So I then went in, I kind of almost like memorized the poem, read it so many times. And then I went through I actually searched a database of Kennedy's speeches looking for similar words and phrases. And it was quite a research project. And then, like most of them came from the Moonshot speech. Some of them came from some other speeches. But trying to get those words to align with the words of the poem. So it was a really cool marriage of research at the beginning, and then almost just like just traditional text setting. And it was an incredibly meaningful thing to me to be writing for Sasha. At the same time, kind of in the same era that I was working with Steve Jobs, where she, of course, was Lorene Powell Jobs. And so I really had her voice in my head for a long time.
Wow. Fascinating.
When you came across the connection between the two texts, was that just like an incredible light bulb? What was that? Was it like this amazing alignment of the stars, or was it more inevitable?
It really was like a light bulb because I started reading the Walt Whitman, and you get to the title and you think Passage to India. Okay, what's this? Is this going to be what I'm looking for? And he immediately starts talking about 1492, the great explorers. We can take a steamship across the ocean. We can take a locomotive across the country. And by the end, he's saying, let's look to the stars. Let's go to the moon. And I was like, this is full on weird at this point that they're connecting so much. Walt Whitman really is one of those visionaries that I don't think we'll ever really find a match for. I mean, he's so full of vision. And I love connecting these two Americans across the centuries. So yeah, it was an exciting moment when I read that poem.
You know, I was so overwhelmed when you even just found out what you were basing this on. It's very connected to like my dad. He used to talk about, I think he did some big research paper on the contrast between Passage to India and A Passage to India, the Forester. And so he used to talk
Oh,
about that. And also he would always quote the Kennedy speech like that. So those two different things you could buy. Like I grew up, he always would say, the classic lines from the speech. We choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Like I grew up on those two different topics. I was shocked when I like combined because it was kind of a nostalgia element.
wow.
But as
I
you
didn't know
mentioned, wait, what?
that. Cool. I didn't know that you had that background. That's really cool.
No, it's like right. I quote that all the time to orchestras when we're about to do a really crazy project. I always say, "Why are we doing this in two rehearsals? Not because it is easy, but because it's hard." I've used that so many times, and it doesn't work very well. I think it works better for Kennedy. Orchestras are a tough audience, but as you mentioned, you were writing this specifically for Sasha, right? Was that from the beginning?
Yeah, right. I mean,
That was from the beginning. And Sasha,
yeah,
what was that
yeah.
like? I mean, how does that? Because obviously you have such a wide range of musical styles that you seem completely comfortable with. I mean, what did you know about the project? How did you feel comfortable with that?
Well, I just always admired Mason's music, so it was kind of a thrill. And then to do his first opera and then this piece, which is probably unlike anything you've written, Mason, right? Isn't Passage unlike anything else?
I think it's fair to say, yeah.
I mean, it was just so cool to be having those two firsts and share them. I mean, I had known Mason's work a long time. So, yeah, I mean, and it's also a thrill when you get a score and it's well written because you don't know, like writing for the voice is not writing for a symphony. It's just not, and and you don't have to do both well. I mean, I was just saying in this other talk today about opera, it's like, why do all composers feel like they have to write an opera? It's not actually meant for everybody. And it's kind of one of the hardest things to do. So why do it if you really shouldn't? But Mason actually has that knack for the voice, which you kind of almost, it's like a roll of the dice. Like I've tried to figure this out, why some figure that out and others don't, because it's almost, because you do have to, in some sense, understand the apparatus and understand the body and the way to sing. And it's not an instrument. It's not just another instrument, So that was lucky. And then text setting. That's the other big thing about writing for the voice, is that it's really unified with the way it melds with the text. And of course, the way Mason does that is magical. So then it's easy. Then it's all easy. For so many people, it's not the case.
And you said that it's a very different piece from Mason's other work. I mean, do you mean also specifically from the opera? I mean, which for everybody's benefit is, of course, the Steve Jobs opera. I mean, that obviously is totally different subject matter and a different sound world. But was the vocal writing familiar to you when you worked on the two?
Actually, they're very different. I think they're very different. I wonder what Mason thinks about this, and I love that because that means it's really it's content specific. It's speaking to the atmosphere of what you're creating, and I think they're totally two different worlds. And what was the other part of your question?
I think that was the question, right?
Was that the question? No, there was something else I wanted to say. I lost it. But I think what I was going to say is just that Mason was writing for a voice and orchestra. Like, I don't know if he's written that many pieces in that setting. So that was unique. And it's kind of a Shana, as you remember. I mean, it's like, you don't get a lot of time to rest, which is sort of exhilarating, whereas the opera is very different. You're sharing scenes with people. There aren't 15-minute moments that I'm singing. Do you know what I mean? So that's kind of really exhilarating to do. I think Passage is an incredible piece, and I think it has a long future ahead. And I think for so many reasons, some of which Mason's probably not even aware, it's truly extraordinary, and that's, if we think about the composers whose works we do forever and ever, it's like a personality that just comes through, right? It's a voice that is uniquely themselves. We were just talking about this before Mason came on the call, right? So there are so many amazing people who are fabulous, you know, orchestrators and have great ideas, but is it something that is like a thumbprint, you know?
A distinguishable style.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Sasha, you too. I mean, on the topic of thumbprints or handwriting, I mean, your voice is. I remember when I heard you for many years, but when I was then thinking about, you know, okay, we've got this opera to write, and I heard you at the symphony, and I remember specifically thinking, you know, your voice is so rich, particularly in the chiaroscuro register, but obviously it has a huge range. And I remember thinking it really is a kind of almost like an organ in a way, like obviously it's a vocal organ, but I mean like an organ, in that it has all these colors and registers. And I remember thinking, just don't screw this up. Don't pile stuff on it all the time. So there are a couple places in Passage, particularly when there's that kind of out in space moment when it's almost like you're in the void. And it's really just your voice with a little bit of sound design. It's really mellow. That to me was a lesson that I basically learned from listening to you, which is that a voice is something that has so much tone and color to it that if you set it in the right way, your job is to get away from all the other instruments for a moment. And I really will always be thankful to you for showing me how you can do it just by singing.
Thank you for saying that. And I love that moment so much. I find so many composers don't enjoy silence and take advantage of space, because we literally had space in that moment in so many ways.
Right.
What you're saying about Sasha's voice also is parallel to what you told me about working with her, because we never even met.
I'm difficult. I'm very difficult.
No, well, I mean, so many singers are. I don't think there's any, obviously it's no secret. And I often dread the first meeting because especially with new projects, because it's just, you just don't know what you're going to have to deal with psychologically that week. And sometimes it's kind of fun to parse that, but a lot of times it's just one more headache. And Mason called like a week before. I remember I was studying the score, and I had a couple questions, I think, and we were talking, and I'd heard this from so many other people. Of course, I heard your voice without knowing you, but Mason's like, you are going to love working with Sasha. And I can say that it's not every day that somebody calls and says that about singers. Like they'll say the great singer, amazing talent, something like that, but you're just like, you're going to love working with her. And it was just such an unbelievable experience because of it's on so many levels, but because of the command that you had over this piece. I've worked with a lot of singers, especially in new music, where they are just treading water, even with a beautiful instrument, a beautiful voice, but it's like hanging on for dear life if we're gonna like get that cue or coming on that pitch, and it's just, you don't know what's gonna happen. And it was like working with any great instrumental soloist, in that, of course, if you play, it doesn't matter, a brand new concerto or a Beethoven concerto, you expect that they know when to come in. Like, it's not like a lot of others. And it was so incredible. Like I could sense, I knew exactly what to do in conducting it, because it was all mapped out in your way of presenting it. This is just a long way of saying, but the question there is, I'm curious, how did you come to that? Because that was, even then, was still a relatively new piece, just you'd only been doing it a short while at that point. How did you develop a sense of ownership of the work?
Just when you love something, it's easier. And when it's well done, it's easier. When there's less there, it's harder. When you don't have things to hang your hat on, and you don't have moments you savor, and you're not looking forward to things, then it feels more like work. And I know we all can relate to this. When you're in an environment where, you know what I mean? So when you're enjoying something, it's just like a tune. Like when we go away from something, singing something, or one of our favorite songs, how do we remember the lyrics? Because there's a great tune to it, right? And so when that happens, when you feel like, oh, I got this, it's in my body, then it's not difficult. And it's interesting you ask, though, because I remember it was a very busy period. And I remember writing Mason saying, I'm learning like 5 premieres in one spring, and I'm traveling and da-da-da-da. And so I played it a lot. I played because I as we talked about, I can get through on the piano with it, and that, and then of course the electronic component. I mean, what's not to love about that? You know, and there are a lot of cues too that I would look forward to sonically that helped kind of anchor me in the piece, and they helped me also create the emotional atmosphere I wanted. You know, the horizon of the piece, kind of what I'm seeing in the space. So then it becomes very performative. Then it's like a show, you know, it's like memorized in the body and in the voice.
Well, and you've both mentioned at this point one element of it that I think is really special, and that's that much of the piece is slow. Obviously, there's an incredible last moment there of liftoff, but much of the piece is actually incredibly spacious. It has room to do something that a lot of current music doesn't, and that's actually to play with time. That it's designed to have an opinion about the timing, what we call rubato, but not a strict sense of time that where everything's just locked into a ever lasting beat. And I think that's one of the things that distinguishes it. It's actually an incredibly fluid piece. You feel like you can actually shape it while it's being performed in a way that you usually get from Mahler and Strauss and Brahms. And not so many composers give you that latitude these days. And I'm curious, Mason, was that something you consciously went in thinking about? Because you do have a lot of music that's quite locked in, that's has a more metronomic element, but this one it feels like you're almost conducting romantic music with that malleability.
Well, I'm glad to hear you mention it. I think one thing that's basic to me is that I grew up in a church school, the Episcopal Church, and was in a choir. So it's not the same kind of singing, and I'm not a very good singer. But being raised in a choral situation has made me kind of revert to some sort of like basic musical generative thing in my body when I'm working with a voice that a lot of times results in people saying to me, I've never heard the side of you when they hear a vocal piece. A lot of people said it about the opera. And I'm thinking, wow, that's always been there. And some of my first music, not for a piano, was for choir. So that's one thing. And it tends to push me into a world of more fluidity and tempo freedom. That said, this piece, because there's this travel element, we're traveling to India, we're traveling across the United States in a railroad, we're going to the moon. I wanted to put the travel music and the lyrical, expressive, kind of mystical music in greater relief. So when we're mystical, and then when we're moving, it's really kind of churning there. So I find that having those two play off each other certainly can make them both feel more gratifying. The thing that also I think about with this piece that's different is that when you have a spoken word, like when you have a spoken voice, it is so interesting what happens to the way you listen when you have a spoken voice. I learned that when I was writing a piece called The B-Sides that has this also a space element, but it's completely different. It's an actual astronaut, spacewalk. And I realized that when you're hearing a spoken voice, you kind of immediately go to that, and anything else that's happening musically, better be chill or it's going to get thrown under the bus. So in this piece, when you hear all of this, it's not just JFK, but there's some news reports and things. There's just kind of like the orchestra just kind of flashes into this, like freezes into these sonorities. And I had worked with spoken voice before in some situations, but I don't think I'd ever worked with a spoken voice and then a sung voice. And so that was really a fascinating part of it. And I love watching Sasha at the end when both JFK and Whitman line up on the word sail, when we set sail. And there's this moment when Sasha has to kind of catch the words as he's saying them, as JFK is uttering sail. And you're saying, oh, further sail. He's saying, we set sail. And it's really kind of poignant to see how a singer is making music with JFK. It's really, it's inspiring to see you do that.
that explode.